Today we're going to look at assessment in reading instruction. We're going to be looking particularly at vocabulary assessment. So today we're going to take a minute and just really think about vocabulary and the role it plays in reading instruction and reading assessment. So the first thing I wanted you to consider is as part of your work for this course, you looked at an ACT, a sample passage from an ACT, and I wanted you to stop, I think maybe it was SAT actually, I want you to stop and think about how much of that passage really relied on strong vocabulary skills. If you didn't really consider that, I want you to go back and look at that passage and really consider that question. So take a minute to just think about the role that vocabulary plays in such a high stakes test, right? If you think about this, this is a test that's going to determine entrance into college. It's going to be determining scholarship opportunities and things like that. And it doesn't really truly measure our abilities or our potential so much as it measures our exposure to words to some degree. So what we're going to do is we're going to think about vocabulary and what makes it so complex. Then we're going to think about some frameworks for vocabulary assessment, and then we're going to think about how to use that knowledge to develop an appropriate assessment in our own classrooms, okay? All right. Before I begin, I just wanted to show, these anchor standards. I'm sure you're all familiar with the anchor standards that of language. Three of them, I would say, directly correlate to vocabulary acquisition and use. So we have determine the clarity of the meaning of unknown and multiple meaning words and phrases by using context clues, analyzing meaningful word parts, and consulting general and specialized reference materials. Demonstrating understanding of figurative language, word relationships, and nuances in word meaning. And acquire and use accurately a range of general academic and domain-specific words and phrases sufficient for reading, writing, speaking, and listening at the college and career readiness level. Demonstrate independence in gathering vocabulary knowledge when encountering an unknown word to comprehension or expression. So this is where we look at vocabulary as almost in tiers. The Common Core is really telling us to be looking at Tier 2 and Tier 3 words. Tier 2 words are words that have complex, they might have multiple meanings. They're academic. And then Tier 3 words are those words that are really, really domain specific. And so you would only encounter them or might only encounter them in, say, a science class or a math class. Vocabulary was one of the 5 pillars of reading that was identified in the National Reading Panel report, if you remember. So it's really important, though it's not always given its same due as some of the others. And I think that's because we just have not really been able to figure out, how to instruct and assess vocabulary well. One thing that's really important for us to consider is this idea that vocabulary and reading comprehension are unconstrained skills, right? When you have something like phonemic awareness, that's a you know it or you don't know it, right? And there's a lot of discrete skills in those early literacy stages that we can basically say, yes, the kids can do it. But when we think about something like vocabulary and reading comprehension, when you get to the later pillars, they're multidimensional. So you can sort of have that skill, but then not have it in other areas or other dimensions. It's incremental, and it's very context dependent, okay? And so I think that's why vocabulary and reading comprehension are actually a lot harder to assess than some of the earlier literacy skills. So we run into a real paradox here. We know vocabulary is really important. We know that there's several studies. One Pearson study that I looked at tied vocabulary comprehension as a positive correlation between 0.6 and 0.8, which is a very, very significant correlation. But what we don't know is what type of explicit instruction we want, how it affects students' vocabulary skill, and then how that explicit instruction might actually affect our students' overall comprehension. So we're stuck in a paradox right now. We know something is important. We don't really know how to measure it, or because we lack that data, what that data might point to as far as best practices and instructional strategies. Okay. An expert says it's not easy. Let me just go ahead. Margaret McCune is probably one of the premier researchers in vocabulary. So, I'm going to start this.
I guess I kind of came accidentally to the area of vocabulary assessment because as a vocabulary researcher, been mostly concerned with designing instruction and coming up with the kinds of language interactions, getting kids to really interact with language and use language, and teaching them sophisticated words. But in order to evaluate how well the instruction went, we needed some measures and found that most measures that are available are pretty poor at figuring out what kids have gotten from especially a rich vocabulary assessment. We didn't want to know whether they just could repeat the definitions for us. We really wanted to know, could they use the words? What do they know about the words? So that forced us to develop a lot of our own assessments. Done lots of work with teachers. And frequently when I talk to teachers, a big question I get asked is, how do we assess vocabulary? How do we measure? If we're going to do this instruction in vocabulary, how do we know if our kids are getting anything from it? And it's hard. It's hard to come up with good assessments. The practical implication is that vocabulary is an incredibly important area, especially in the era of Common Core standards, where more complex texts have more complex vocabulary. We need to address students' vocabulary needs and know how to do that and what they're getting from it. And so unless we have richer and more sensitive vocabulary measures, we're not going to be able to get that kind of information. So we need better assessments in classrooms and at the broader level, not just ones that individual teachers use, but ones that schools use, so that we have a much more detailed and richer idea of what is it students know about the words that are in their vocabulary, or the words that they're being exposed to in texts and in classes, because only then will teachers know how to address those needs. So our aim is to expand and reimagine the nature of vocabulary assessment. And our overall goal is to develop a set of recommendations for teachers and for researchers about productive ways to measure vocabulary knowledge and growth. And our perspective is that in order to be meaningful, vocabulary assessments need to capture what learners can do with the words that they know. So assessment tasks should reflect how we use vocabulary. So typically, when we're reading a text, for example, we don't have to recall the meaning of every single word we're reading. What we have to do is to access some associations and how they relate to other words in the context, and integrate words in order to come up with the meaning of a text. So that's the kind of direction that we think is productive and meaningful in assessment. So what we aim to do is to bring together scholars across the community. So we really have three distinct groups. We have education researchers who've worked on vocabulary interventions, typically instruction in classrooms with teachers. We have assessment people who've worked on some large-scale assessments like NAEP, like the SAT. And we have linguists, psycholinguists, computational linguists, who have a much broader view of language and use and see what they have to say about how we might think about and examine vocabulary. The kind of knowledge that needs to be assessed is not definitional. It is what can students do with the words that they know, and how useful are those words that they're supposedly learning or that they supposedly know? How do they use them? I think that's what I'd want people to be thinking about.
All right. Okay, so really this offers us some direction and some context into what we should be doing when we're designing vocabulary assessment, and that's really trying to find ways to tie that assessment as closely as we can to the meaning making that we want our students to be doing. And so that's a real challenge. But before we really are able to create strong assessments, particularly in vocabulary, because as we've mentioned, there's not a lot of really good models out there. One of the things that we want to consider is a basic understanding of vocabulary. So one of the things we want to think about is how we develop our vocabulary. So there are some models for that. The Dale stages of vocabulary is really important, especially those of you that teach younger students, and some of you are probably very familiar with that. The stages of vocabulary that Dale identified was never having seen them, knowing that there is a word but not knowing what the meaning is, having context bound and vague knowledge of the word's meaning, and then knowing the word well and remembering it. So that's what that's the stages that we go through between being introduced to a word and actually knowing or understanding the word. McCune, Beck, and Omerson called it stages instead of, or continuum instead of stages. And he goes from no knowledge of the word, general understanding, narrow but context-based understanding, having knowledge or word, but then remembering, but not being able to use it appropriately, and then decontextualized knowledge of the word, where you can use it. And so basically what both of them are saying is, it's different to the old-fashioned word lists that we used to have. The reason that those don't work is because they really don't move us much beyond the general understanding of the word or context-specific use of the word. It's very narrow, and it's not enough. That's why some of us grew up with the red vocabulary books, and they just didn't get our students where we needed them to be. And there's a real reason why. So a lot of people say, well, they don't teach. If we know vocabulary is important, we don't teach vocabulary anymore in schools. We don't teach it the way that we used to, because what we've come to recognize is the way that we used to really doesn't get us very far along the vocabulary continuum. And it kind of really keeps our students down, intentionally by design. And we don't want to do that. We want to move them along the continuum intentionally and by design. The other thing that we need to consider is, since really 1995, we've understood that there's what we call a 3 million word gap between high-income children and low-income children. The amount of words that they hear by the age of 3. And then a follow-up study in 2014, 2013, I think, Stanford University studies really found that gap really, as young as 18 months, we can start to see this gap. So what the word gap, or 3 million word gap, talks about is the fact that these are the number of words that our students have heard, spoken to them directly, ambient conversation around them. But there's a significant difference between 11 million for the low income to 43 million for the higher income. And, when you think about that, you have to think about this not just in terms of words, but also what goes along with the words. The experiences, the trips to the museums, to zoos, the travel that might entail, the exposure to books, because, books cost money. So it's not just that the child is being spoken to differently, it's also that the child is getting enrichment opportunities in upper incomes that they're not getting in lower incomes. So it's a really complex, and you should not simplify this. There's not much there's not much use in sort of declaring the 3 million word gap and then that ending. We have to think about its implications. And the other side of the scale also talks about the vocabulary that the students use. There's a significant difference between low-income and high-income children. Just the words that they use, the words that they know. So what we have to consider then is some of our students don't come in with the knowledge of vocabulary or the knowledge that comes through experiences. And this is a picture of I want to say Daniel Williamson. Yes, I keep remembering, sometimes I call him David and his name is Daniel. This is Daniel Willingham, who is an educational psychologist, and he studies knowledge and the importance of knowledge. And I think this has a real important clue into vocabulary. One of the things that, he's really somebody who's calling for a lot of reform in the way that we teach reading, especially in the early grades. And one of the things that he talks about is that critical thinking, which would be critical reading, is not a skill of skills and strategies that can be directly taught, practiced, and then applied to any topic. It's very context dependent. And it's something that has to be embedded, and that students have to, it's like a continuum, they can't just directly do it. Students need deep knowledge of a subject in order to think creatively about that subject, and there are no shortcuts to that kind of thinking, critical thinking or creative thinking. It starts with the facts, and one of the most basic facts that you would need is the vocabulary, right? You need to have the nomenclature. So he would argue that we really, without developing our students' vocabulary knowledge, we really are not going to be able to build the knowledge and get them ready for the critical thinking. He studies a lot about the role of background knowledge. I mean, his real area is in background knowledge, but But knowledge, both vocabulary and content knowledge, are so intertwined that I thought I would put him up here for you to consider as you're thinking about the role of vocabulary assessment. So thinking this, moving on here and sort of reconsidering this, I have here this 70%. And what this represents is that 70% of what we have identified, or what researchers have identified, as the 9,000 critical vocabulary words for elementary students to know. 70% of them are what we would call polysemous, which means that 70% of them you need to have content to understand the specific meaning, because there are more than one meaning. For instance, the word operation. Use the word operation in math very differently than I would use the word operation in science or social studies or something like that, right? Words are linguistically complex. Incrementality means you don't know a word all or nothing. There's increments. So if I know the word operation as in terms of the medical use of the word operation, and I don't know it in terms of the mathematical operation, it doesn't mean I don't know the word. It means I have incremental knowledge of the word. Multidimensional. The multidimensionality means there's nuances or co-locations of words. Like, you need to know, like, a lot of these are just kind of, cultural. Like, for instance, we know that we talk about something being a storm front, but we don't use the word storm back for the end of the storm, right? So it's multidimensional. It's very nuanced, okay? Polysemic means that their words have multiple meanings. For instance, the word run. Very simple word, sight word, kindergarten sight word, first grade sight word. There's 20 meanings to the word run. So, keeping that in mind is important. And then the last thing is heterogeneity, which is a word's meaning differs depending on its function and its structure. This is something that David Willingham talks a lot about. So, I spilled the coffee is something that, okay, its function here, the words function and structure matter here. I spilled the coffee. Do I need to now go get a mop, or do I need to now go get a broom, right? And to be able to understand that, I probably need to know more about the words around it, because if I spilt like the coffee beans, then I would go get a mop. If I spilt like a coffee in my cup, then I would go get a broom. And if I spilt it in my cup, I would go get a mop. And so there's a lot more that I need to consider. The word's meaning differs depending on its function and its structure. I need to know more, so I probably need more text or visual clue that would give me the ability to understand what, and make meaning of that particular sentence. So that's kind of, something to keep in mind. And it's also amazing if you ever do like an open, even a comprehension test, where you have the students explain their thinking. It's amazing what you find as far as how often they're not necessarily wrong with their understanding of the word or the phrase. They just are kind of not looking at it in its context, in the broader context. So this is something that students need a lot of practice with. So what we want to consider then is, what are some things that we can do to sort of develop our students' ability to be able to deal with these linguistic complexities? One of the things we might consider, and this is probably not as documented or studied, but you can talk about etymology of the words. This tells you, the story of the words, the origin of the words. There's a lot of great resources out there. So when I was looking at, some strategies or the use of mostly I was looking at word attack strategies, morphology. One of the things I found was, in an article talking about the use of etymology and using stories as a way to engage students into words, I found out that the word vanilla is derived from the Latin root for vagina. Now, I might not use that with my little guys, but that might be some way to build in some interest, right, with the older people, right, with my older students. Morphology is the study of word forms, including prefixes, suffixes, and root words. So especially as our students are getting older, we want to teach them to really look at morphology. So think about this. So we're going to teach the common patterns. So if I taught my students common patterns, and they got this word symbiosis, and they have no idea what symbiosis is, If I could get them to understand sim and sin, that these are common prefixes that are interrelated, then that means together. Bio means life and cis means state. What I can do is, if they put those together, those understanding the morphology together, they can attack that word and come to a working definition about this meaning. Oh, these must be the state of being together, of living together. And so that gets them to some understanding of symbiosis that then they can use to create meaning from the text and to develop a more nuanced and more complex understanding of symbiosis. But it's the way in, right? Morphology is the way in for those. So thinking about the use of etymology and morphology in your instruction and how it might help your students when they get to the situation where they're looking at vocabulary assessments. So what we do know is that students need to demonstrate knowledge of the word beyond the definitions. We know that students, that not all words are created equal. So if we're going to be, doing direct instructional words, we want to be very careful about those words. So a study in 2000 by the National Reading Project demonstrated that students learn vocabulary best when it's used in meaningful and authentic contexts, when it's tiered words, which means that when there are words that are used frequently within the content areas. And so what we want to think about then is how to get the students into these meaningful contexts to give them the ability to use words in a meaningful and authentic way. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to show a couple of assessments that are used out there. I'm not going to go to the whole thing. I won't show it again.
All right. Hey, Ella, how are you today? Come on in. Good. Have you had a good morning so far?
Yes.
Good. Did you eat your breakfast?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. So today, I am going to show you some pictures and ask you to point to some things for me. Okay? Just a little test, a little bit of pictures we got to look at. First off, Ella, how old are you, Ella?
I am 6.
You're 6 years old. When is your birthday?
January the 10th.
January 10th. So you just turned 6, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So you were born in what year? Do you know? It's okay. Alrighty. So make sure this is good.
She's establishing the age of the
There you go.
and
Scoot back just a little bit. I don't want to hit you with it. Perfect. Alright, we're going to do a couple practice, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Look at the pictures on this page. Put your finger on the baby. Very good.
Okay, so this is an early screening. It offers a quick estimate of your students' receptive vocabulary, meaning the vocabulary that they're coming in where they can, they'll be able to understand and receive the message that you're creating. So this is the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. Another kind of test that you see is Iowa Test of Basic Skills, which the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, you'll see it's context. Choose the word that is the closest in meaning to the underlined word above it. So the students then use the context. Now, it doesn't give a lot of context, which is sometimes problematic for tests like this, but this is a kind of vocabulary that your students might face. We might want to think about some of the things to consider when we're developing our own vocabulary assignments. Discrete versus embedded, we want to know, do you want to test the words in isolation? So if given context, this framework assumes that vocabulary is going to be able, that the students are going to be able to assess that vocabulary. It's not really often true. I think that that's something that we want to consider. And so we want to think about whether or not you want to do it or embed it into, so you embed it into the rest of the reading, the rest of the literacy, or maybe the content. Selective versus comprehensive is selective, where you would go to a smaller word set versus larger word sets. Comprehensive, so you have to think about, do we just want to go a couple of high power words? And then we want to think about, do we want them to have context-independent vocabulary framework for assessing vocabulary, or do we want to make it context-dependent? Those are all things to consider for yourself, how you want to frame your instruction and why you want to frame it that way. So here's something that you might want to think about having the students do. So these are some things that you can do as formative assessments. So if you give your students a pretest where you have them, rate how well they know the words, and then they can use that to figure out later in the post-test. Here's a pretest that you might give where you ask them to categorize based on the area or the thematic focus of the upcoming text. And then you give them that same thing as a post-test. So you can see something like that. Okay. Another thing that you might consider is what we call a vocabulary assessment magazine, where you read the passage with the vocabulary. Then you have the students respond to an open-ended question. And then they draw and write vocabulary from the passage. And we use the drawing because what we call that is cross-coding. There's some research emerging that indicates that our, that being able to think visually helps us with oral interpretation and visual or critical thinking. So, all right. So if you look on Leo, you'll see some information about a vocabulary assessment reflection. Hopefully this gives you some background as well as the reading so that you can really consider your use of vocabulary assessments and maybe try to work to take it to the next level.